Welcome everybody, my name is Anthony James, founder and CEO of LinuxAcademy.com, and today I'm joined in office by Adam Miller, who has been running the Ansible Fort Worth meetup, and that's how we actually cross paths. And welcome, Adam, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Adam Miller. I work at Red Hat. I've been there a little over 6 years. I'm currently on the Ansible Core engineering team, working on the core execution runtime, as well as trying to do everything I can to foster the community, just because I'm both a developer and a giant fan of the technology, which is what led to me to work there in the first place, which is also what led me to seek out a location to host the meetup, and y'all were gracious enough to do that here. Beyond that, I also do work on some various Ansible integrations, one of them being outreach to technology such as OpenShift, containerized things, other spaces that I can hopefully be helpful.
Well, and when you came to the office today, I walked up and you were talking to Treva, and you were just talking about some of the stuff that was going on, and you made the comment of it's just all basic stuff that had to get done, or not basic stuff. It was complex, but you had to do it. It's not that interesting. Treva's like, no, that is super interesting, and it's just kind of funny hearing and talking about those things. So this is going to be a great interview. Now on that, you joined Fedora as a community contributor in 2007.
Yeah, I believe so. I probably am off a little bit on my date, which is why I didn't offer a month. But it's why I didn't offer a month. But I'm almost positive it was sometime late 2007 is where I first started contributing. I began as a Red Hat Linux user in 2000. Like very early 2000, it was like January, February. I remember because I asked for a copy of Red Hat Linux for Christmas, which is a whole different story.
Did you get it?
I did.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I got
Good
Red Hat.
parents.
I got Red Hat 7 Deluxe Workstation. I literally wrote on the paper. I was like, go to Best Buy, ask somebody where this is. If they don't know, tell them it's by Windows. Because at the time, you could go into Best Buy and there was Windows, there was Red Hat, there was SUSE, and nobody does box sets anymore except for Windows because they still target the consumer market. But anyways, so I started as a user and then just became very enthusiastic about the technology, what we could do with it, the power of open source. Open source as a mantra or as a standing ovation to how software could or should be developed in the community space, such that the collective whole of our knowledge will always be exponentially larger than any one of us can possibly contain or know. We only have so much brain capacity. So it was really cool to kind of get involved and meet people in the community and all that stuff. So as soon as I felt like I knew enough about computing, I started contributing back, and that was around 2007.
Well, I think it's great. And first off, I just want to say thank you, because what's really awesome is when you come in and when you're having those conversations, you always are talking about that, right? So for you, it's a true passion. It's a passion for the open source community. It's a passion for the Linux community, and that's just awesome. And in fact, let's talk a little bit about that passion by showing a picture. So if you don't mind, just hold up your arm real quick, and let's talk about this Red Hat logo that you have. And Jim Whitehurst actually refers to it on what page in the Open Organization book you wrote? What page are you on?
So the Open Organization, I'm on page 41. I've committed that to memory because I was just really excited about it, and I communicated it to my whole family. I called my grandma, the whole spiel. At heart, I am a computer nerd. I will always be a computer nerd. That's why I'm here. Aside from my family, that's why I wake up in the morning. The open source movement has become such a huge part of my life. So I started in 2000 with Red Hat Linux, and then during the Red Hat Linux Fedora split, I kind of took a vacation because I call it a hiatus onto other Linux distributions, because I didn't know enough about Linux to really debug the fact that Fedora Core 1 wouldn't boot on any computer I owned. However, a few releases later, everything was stabilized. It was a whole new bring up of a new project focusing on an operating system. It was a large undertaking. So once it stabilized, I made my way back, and I've been with Red Hat ever since. So or at least Red Hat family of technologies ever since. And so the Red Hat family of technologies, from a community perspective, from the fact that the community outreach, the community embracement, the development model being upstream all the time, the fact that 100% of the products source code is open source. All of the projects that the products are based on, we support and contribute back to, either through code or monetarily or both. So that ethos actually spoke to me and kind of guided and built my career without even realizing it at the time it was happening. So the tattoo marked 10 years of being a part of the Red Hat open source community through Red Hat various technologies, that kind of thing. And I always have to like tell that story because a lot of people were like, oh, you're dedicated to the company, to the brand, and like that. I've had a few people. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about tattoos and companies, and that spawned off this other article about how companies are evil and all stuff. I was like, no, like you understand why I got it and what it matters to me and how that shaped my life.
It's the mission.
It's the mission.
It's the culture and mission.
Yeah. It's the whole thing in the sense that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. And if we could ever get around the whole concept of paywalls for doctoral research, we would be a little bit better at it from the scientific perspective. But the scientific community is very big in sharing that knowledge. And in software, historically, it's been like, no, this is my intellectual property. And as a side effect, like Red Hat even embraces the open intellectual property. I can't remember the appropriate name of the project, but there's actually a project where we've entered in a business venture with other companies to have these open patents that anyone can use. And if somebody uses it and tries to sue you or something, like we will collect this collective of companies will defend one another and that kind of thing.
Kind of share the resources to help each other out.
Absolutely. And that kind of thing, that the whole concept, like not only from the code perspective, because from the code perspective, we've been doing that forever. Like that's not new, but actually doing that from a business perspective and doing that from a legal standpoint, that ethos runs through the company all the way through. So I got the tattoo, and then about 9 months after that, I finished up my graduate degree. And once I finished grad school, not long after that, had the very positive opportunity and something I'll be forever thankful for to join Red Hat, and I've been there ever since. And it's one of those things where, as an outsider, as a community member, you look at it and you're like, okay, I have this idea, I have this ideal in my head of what it is and how amazing it could be. Mm-hmm. And there's always that fear of like going in and it's like Wizard of Oz. It's like, oh, the person behind the curtain. It's amazing. I've loved it.
Everything you hoped it would be.
So my favorite story to tell is our CEO has a computer science degree from Rice University and runs Fedora Linux on his laptop. Like, we don't have a divide between the business and the technologists. We don't have a divide between, non-developers and developers in terms of the ethos. Like, everybody lives this as a component of who we are. So ever since that, it's just been a reinforcement of the tattoo. And people are just like, what if you get bought? Like, it'll be an homage to a better time. So,
I mean, Red Hat's pretty big.
I think we've reached, so this was 6 years ago. We've been very fortunate to reach a point of success that that's probably relatively rare, but I'll never say never.
Well, and Jim Whitehurst is the CEO, and it was actually great. I got to go listen to him in a small, intimate talk. Some of our lawyers connected us to a talk with it. He was talking about his open book. There was 20 of us there. I got it signed. And what I got to tell you, like, the most impressive part of it, and it's something that you don't see in a lot of companies, right? Different CEOs come in, different cultures change, and it's about sometimes profit, the shareholders. In business school, they say, you look after the shareholders. And I fundamentally disagree with that. And what's really awesome about Red Hat and Jim Whitehurst is he does that, and the people at Red Hat, because as he would say, it's that culture. It's already there. He's just going in and being a part of that culture in that type of way. So he's not trying to change that. But it's just really great to see somebody that recognizes the values of the open source community, the values of what you're trying to do, what they're trying to do, and what the community's trying to do, and really embraces that from a technological standpoint versus a dollars and cents. How do we eke out the profits here? How do we do this? It's really great to see that, and I love that business model. It's really awesome to see, you're the second Red Hat person that we interviewed, and it's really just instilled the culture all the way through, and it's a fascination of mine. So that's really, really awesome. So real quick, before we go into fun technology stuff, Did that help you get the job at Red Hat? Because you had that before, right?
I had it before. I'm a remote employee. Mm-hmm. About half of our engineering department company-wide are remote, geographically dispersed to wherever they feel like working remote from. I was interviewed entirely over the phone. Nobody knew I had it. Nobody knew I had it except for one person I don't know if they disclosed it to others, but one person knew because I knew them from the Fedora community for many years. However, nobody throughout the company up the management chain knew about it until after I came for new hire orientation, and that was a lot of fun. Because I was the new person that had the tattoo, and that had never been done before. So that was really cool.
Did you keep saying, no, I had it before. I didn't did it because I got the job.
So I was the third one to have it that I know of. So I don't know who was first between Jan Wildeber or Thomas Cameron, but there were three of us originally, and the three of us in that photo that came in the Wall Street Journal, there was a picture of us at Summit, and everyone's like, oh, we finally got the three together. But by that point in time, we're like, oh, no, there's like 7 of us. As it is today, I believe there's like 15 or 16 of us that have the tattoo.
Oh, wow.
And it's just people who've, been driven by that passion for, some number of years, and it just kind of speaks out to them.
And it's what it represents, right?
For me, it's similar to how people have symbols that identify things that are important to them in life. And that's what it is to me.
It represents that community. It represents how you got involved with it and what it means to you.
Absolutely.
That's really great. And you got that constant reminder. So that's really awesome. Yep. And you heard it first, getting a Red Hat tattoo does not equate to an instant job at Red Hat. So don't necessarily go get a Red Hat tattoo because we don't have proof that that's how you get a job at Red Hat. Being on the Ansible core team and knowing that OpenShift is a huge initiative at Red Hat for container deployment and orchestration and all that other great stuff, we're gonna have some great conversations here. But first off, when we think about Ansible, what drew you to Ansible, and what's your role on the Ansible core team? What are some big problems that excite you that you've been able to work with or solve with Ansible, or solve in tandem with Ansible on the core team?
So, oh man, that's a big question to ask, and I'm going to start answering it from before I was on the Ansible core team. Because
But you were at Red Hat for this?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
and what team were you on there then?
When Ansible came into existence, I was still on the OpenShift Online team. So I was part of the operations team that ran OpenShift Online.
When did, if you don't mind me asking real quick, when did OpenShift first become available? What was their first release? What year was that?
It was before I worked at the company. So OpenShift existed before I worked there, OpenShift.com.
Yeah.
So the previous platform, which was based on actually C groups, which is a technology that current generation containers use. So inside of the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, there's the OCI, Open Container Initiative.
I believe that's
project.
Correct.
Yeah. So the OCI has this definition of what is a container and the container formats for the images. They're currently working on the registry for distribution patterns, that kind of thing. So C groups is a core component of what creates a runtime for containers. So run C, Koros is Rocket, Docker, and on the back end of Docker, they actually use run C and container D. Like all these things, they all use C groups to actually do resource constraint. So OpenShift v1 way back when, and this was, I think it was like 7 years ago when it first launched. Because when I joined, it had been around for a little while, and then about a year into me being there, we had actually launched the OpenShift Enterprise version, which you could run on-premise in your data center.
Which is still available, right?
It is, yeah, absolutely. It's now called OpenShift Container Platform to kind of designate the differentiation between what the previous technology was and the current generation technology is. We also did a major revision from 2.x to 3.x to kind of signify the architectural change, and there was a lot of messaging around that, and we can get into some of the history of that if we want to.
And probably another interview. There's probably so much.
Yeah,
of
I mean,
that.
it's there's so many tangents on tangents, and it's like, oh, rabbit hole, and next thing you know, you shoot up a day. OpenShift was around for a very long time, and we worked with a lot of the same technologies that fed into the creation of the current generation container technologies. But we had this internal deployment mechanism, and the internal deployment mechanism was custom written, and it only did orchestrated in-order task execution. So we, ironically enough, also chose YAML as our input format to say, these are the steps that we want to take place. And that was, okay, do the deploy of this, take these out of the load balancer, do the deploy of this, do a database schema migration, like all this stuff step by step. And then when we need to do ad hoc tasks, we actually used PSSH. And then Ansible came into existence, and once it kind of reached a certain level of maturity, we saw the benefit of utilizing that for that piece of work. And at that time, we were still using another configuration management utility for the actual configuration management. And that worked out really well. We had all this time investment into that. We already had all of our configuration there. There's no need to rip and replace. Ansible was able to augment that for us and just replace that customer and thing that we'd created. And the reason we wanted to do that is because, number one, what we had wasn't the most reliable thing. Every now and again, we'd push a bug and it's like, crud. Goodness. But also we had a pile of parts that was developed by us and that we were left with maintaining. And in line with the open source mantra and the open source way, there was this open source community that was vibrant and it was growing, that had this common tool set that did effectively exactly what we wanted, and even way beyond the capacity or the capability that we needed. So we joined in that, and then because of my drive and passion for that technology in Ansible, I started working on it a little bit on my free time. I've joined the community. It became something I'd write code on periodically. And it was so interesting to me because I have a system administration background. So I went to school for computer science and I was like, I'm going to be a programmer for life. And then I fell into a system administration job running Linux, and I loved it. It was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed the work. I loved standing up infrastructure. And I was fortunate enough to work in a company where we racked and stacked our own servers. We ran network cables. We did everything from PDU management for power all the way up to system administration. You have root on everything. You're on call. If the server dies in the middle of the night, you're coming up here, kind of thing. And that was an amazing learning experience. But we had a lot of challenges at the time that would have easily been solved by a technology like Ansible. And so Ansible shows up. I'm immediately excited about it. I'm immediately just drawn to it. And we were able to solve the problem of, okay, this thing that we have that we've custom written, there's a capacity problem. Once we hit a certain node count, it starts having trouble.
So scaling was an issue for you.
Scaling was an issue for us. And some of that might have been, so we were using a message queue on the back end to do all of the back end coordination of that. And some of it could have been our inexperience with the message queuing technology that we'd chosen. However, I pretty much ruled that out because we actually called in, because Red Hat is Red Hat, we actually called in some of the developers who wrote that message queue and we're like, hey, are we doing this right? And they're like, yeah, no, that looks good. So we're pretty sure it wasn't the message queue. It was something else, and it was just one of those things where it became a maintenance problem where we have all this other operational work that we're busy with. We have all this other work that we're trying to do to bring up services and maintain presence for our customers and all those things. But that was always a problem. So deployments would take longer because we were fighting fires on the run. So we've slowly phased out our customer and thing, brought in Ansible, and it was great because we were able to augment the configuration management tool that we already had. So for everything in Etsy. So the Etsy directory was managed by the configuration management tool. We didn't want to mess with that.
Maintaining your configuration state. So if you change something somewhere, you want to be changed everywhere.
Absolutely. The eventual consistency. The agent checks in, does a thing. And we also actually would do pre-builds of the configuration of that so that we didn't have a thundering herd problem on the management. So when we were doing a deploy, we would deploy to the entire infrastructure at once. So we would just so with Ansible, we would just scale up our forks and we would fire and we would knock out deployments. So we brought down our deployment time by a sizable amount, and also we had a more maintainable, more scalable solution. And that immediately I was enamored and sold on Ansible. And then going from OpenShift to Fedora, because as a Fedora contributor for a very long time, was a Fedora contributor in college. To me, it was the summit upon which that you must reach was working full time on the Fedora team, because they're an amazing team. They do great work, and it was a place I wanted to be. And I think
it's kind of a small team, isn't it?
It's a very small team. So I think that's relatively commonly known information. The Fedora team is actually about 10 to 12 people, depending on, it's like, well, the kernel team is absolutely Fedora team, but they have a very focused job, and the kernel is a sizable mammoth of technology itself to focus on. But they do, they are integrated into the Fedora workflow. They keep up with current trends. They focus on initiatives that Fedora is chasing after, for example, like power management in the laptops and that kind of thing. So for the mobile devices, they're like, okay, well, let's spend some cycles focusing on those kinds of features, upstream, that kind of stuff. So they're definitely tied in. But anyways, relatively small team, a lot of work to do. And I think unbeknownst to that team, themselves, but they were mentors to me when I was in college. When I was an early contributor, I feel as though the experience I got working on open source and the experience I got in the infrastructure group, as well as from the packaging and developing software, and for the first time ever, really learning how to like port software between hardware architectures. Like that was just mind-boggling to me, because before that it's just there was only one, and it was the one that I owned, and I'd never known that in later years in college, like you get introduced to comp.org and they're like, oh yeah, there's like this whole world of stuff out there. But by that point in time I hadn't run into it, so it was just I learned probably almost as much, if not more, from the Fedora team who became mentors to me as I did in college. It's just kind of like two sides of the same coin. It's the theoretical and then the practical. And it was amazing.
So you immersed yourself in it, and you followed them, and you looked at what they did, and that's one of the best ways that you learned.
Absolutely. So I wanted to be there. Well, so I joined there, and what's very interesting about the Fedora team is 2 members of the Fedora team actually contributed to the creation of Ansible. So because of that, and because of their motivation, so some people might not know, Ansible is kind of a evolutionary approach to a similar problem that a tool called Func, F-U-N-C, aimed to solve. Func was developed inside of Fedora. Ansible solved a lot of its design problems. Interestingly enough, in the same way it solved design problems of our internal tool that we'd written, it solved design problems of that. So there were a couple of people within the Fedora community who actually contributed to its creation with Michael DeHaan, and because of that, because they had input and a lot of what it aimed to solve their use cases, they immediately started to pivot to it from their previous tool chain. So Fedora infrastructure team was rapidly doing that, and then I join in, and they've already done all that. So now everything's powered by Ansible, and we went into this new workflow of trying to solve multi-phase infrastructure rollouts, as well as release engineering, like business workflow. I know business workflow is the wrong term, but basically this workflow for a stepwise procedure that's not necessarily thought of as infrastructure, because release engineering normally kind of happens beforehand, and then somebody like throws some software over the fence. He's like, "Op guys, go do that thing." So you do that, and we had this really interesting inflection point where it's like, okay, we all have the same tool set. We can very easily look at problems cross team. And now we're one big team, because the Fedora release engineering team at the time actually was from a different group, and they were mostly, for like 7 years, like one guy just carrying it across the finish line. But over time, like community members joined in and that kind of stuff. So it was the community members outweighed the people who actually got paid full time to do all this. So now we have a similar tool chain. And then I was advocating for this Ansible everything concept. And it's like, okay, every time you're going to go write a custom script to do something, write an Ansible module or an Ansible playbook or an Ansible role. And always start with the lowest barrier of entry first. Make a playbook. If that doesn't quite work, make a role. If that doesn't quite work and you need actually some programmatic things, okay, write a module or a plugin. And then by doing that, if you run it on one system, now we can run it on many. And if you wrote a module for some reason, okay, well now we can tie that into other playbooks. We can reuse that code. Just like if you had written a library. So Ansible kind of became our API, for that kind of stuff. And
so that helped you scale for more than just solving some of those problems.
Absolutely.
Now you had this code that allowed you to scale and focus on new code rather than writing the same code over again.
Absolutely. That was very powerful for our workflows, because we have in Fedora the unique opportunity to have a message bus, a unified message bus across the entire infrastructure. So anything happens in a web app, a message sends out. Anything happens in event log, a message sends out. Anytime a build happens in our build system that feeds into the repositories that people install software from, a message goes out. So we can, and it has all kinds of metadata in it. We can take action on those. So we can actually see, okay, from a release engineering standpoint, at the point in time this CI job finishes because this compose build occurred based on some criteria over here. Now we can take action on that and start our series of tasks. Whereas before, you would wait for some nightly thing. Somebody would show up in the morning, check the logs, see what was good, and then start typing commands. And then over time, they're like, okay, well, let's make shell scripts. So just this pile of shell scripts that's now a decade old. And anyone who's ever messed with a decade old shell scripts It's painful.
Super easy to use.
Yeah,
is what you meant to say.
Perfect. I mean,
100.
yeah. And then the question comes up. It's like, okay, well, is this portable? And by portable, I mean, is this POSIX compliant? And then you get into this whole world of POSIX compliance, and that's a problem. And it's like, well, why do we care about portability? We're only building on one distro. It's like, well, so the problem is that the builders are various releases of the distro, so you don't really know which shell features you're going to have available because, Bash 4 came out with associative arrays and like that kind of stuff. So during that transition period, if you try to take advantage of something new and it would just be a whole thing. So you still had to think about things like that, and over the course of a decade, you cross some of those bridges. So we're now in the grand new world of Ansible, and we're able to use all these things where really what we care about is the version of Python installed, which for the sake of current generation Linux distributions, Ansible covers all versions of Python of currently supported non-end-of-life enterprise Linux distributions, as well as all the way up through 3.7, the latest Python. So it became this point where it's like, okay, well, now we worry less about those compatibilities because Ansible abstracts that for us. And we kind of have that power. It's like, okay, all right, what is our workflow? We need to provision a virtual machine. We need to give it networking. We need to then take action on the operating system inside that virtual machine, and then we need to do some kind of validation to make sure that the service we just deployed is up and functional. And now maybe we need to put it into a load balancer behind the proxies, and then we need to make an edit to HA proxy or something, or we need to add it to a cluster pool. And then once it's in the cluster pool, we need to do some task to enable it or do some kind of health check to make sure everything. So being able to reach out and touch these completely disparate systems in disparate ways and command and control these different things, for us, for our use case, transcended the concept of configuration management. And during that transition period, when they were transitioning over, they augmented. Because absolutely, why throw away that thing? And what's great about Ansible is so the Ansible core team has this joke or unofficial motto. It's not really a joke; it's a serious thing. But we play well with others. A lot of people in the marketplace like to compare us to certain other technologies, and for most of them, we think it's an odd comparison. It's like we work with that, and more often than not, it's like we have a module. We actually have an Ansible module in Ansible core that we ship and distribute to our users that you can actually command and control that thing. So one of your tasks in your automation series is trigger that other thing.
So it's a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox, right? You got to use the best tool
Absolutely.
for the job.
Yeah, and for the concept of automation, and if you want to talk about market trends and everything, automation is becoming increasingly important because of things like immutable infrastructure. We're no longer mutating state on endpoint systems. And that leads into containers.
It's easier to throw it away and start over than it is to try to maintain that state.
Absolutely, and that leads us into
less resources too.
Yes, a little more storage, but we have copy and write file systems. We have the ability to clean that up. But yes, so the idea is that with containers, now your application doesn't actually get configured in place. It gets configured at build time because, for the use case of Docker, you have a Docker file. Every time you make a modification, you build a new one. You have a new set of layers, or you have a whole new image depending on how you're doing your layering and caching and that stuff. And you can push that, and then you pull that and you distribute it and deploy it. Done. If you need to make another change, push and deploy. Something goes wrong, roll back. We're starting to see that happen more in the operating system space as well. So, CoreOS had CoreOS, and then it was called Container Linux, and then Red Hat had Red Hat Atomic Host, so Project Atomic. Now CoreOS joined the Red Hat family. Those are merged or in the process of merging as far as...
Is it going to be Atomic or Core? Do you know?
It got announced at Red Hat Summit. It is Red Hat CoreOS.
Okay.
Yeah. So now we have the ability to do that, and we're not mutating state on the system anymore. Maybe we get state from a cluster environment like etcd, or maybe we're deploying new layer images because at the core of it, at the core of CoreOS, you actually have an image-based update system. So again, if you want to do that kind of thing, so you can do your validation of the sum of parts. because I don't know if people realize this, but packages, so software packages, RPMs, DPKGs, when you use those, there's a transaction that happens in place. There's actually a database in the backend that's being written to. And I always like to go through the fun exercise of, if you're updating glibc, or if you're in the middle of doing a make init for your kernel, and you kick power out from underneath the machine, does it boot? And it's Schrodinger's cat of infrastructure. We don't know. We don't know, because it depends on at what point in the transaction it is. What files?
I love that analogy, by the way.
Yeah, I mean it's
the greatest example ever.
So I always talk about that. And it's like that's the idea, and that's the promise of this whole concept of immutable infrastructure. And it's like, okay, well, if we're not maintaining eventual consistency on the node, what do we need? Well, now we need an automation tool to automate the deployment of those artifacts.
Which is, you were referring earlier as process, right?
Yeah,
You're automating
absolutely.
the process flow, which is different than configuration management.
Absolutely, yeah. And to me, it's we're addressing different problems. In the Venn diagram of capabilities, there is overlap. There's absolutely overlap, which is why I think that you can replace a configuration management tool with Ansible, but you don't necessarily have to, and that's powerful. And so that leads us into the container tooling. That gets us into Kubernetes and Docker and OpenShift and all these things. And so OpenShift specifically, because that's what I have most experience with, and that's the technology I tend to evangelize when I talk about container space, because I think a lot of the features that it brings to the table on top of Kubernetes are very advantageous. And so you have, for starters, as like your day zero Ansible integration, the OpenShift installer is built on Ansible. It's a giant set of roles and plugins and modules and playbooks that you deploy OpenShift with, and it handles all sorts of infrastructures. So on-premise, virtual machines, AWS, Azure, Google Compute. You have a lot of options, and I'm sure there's other community contributed ones. I'm just thinking of the ones I know of from that are like certified. But that's really cool in the sense that it allows you kind of a jump point, because if you're already familiar with that tooling, then when you're doing day two operations, you're doing cluster level lifecycle management outside of the cluster itself. So you have cluster administrators who are administering inside the cluster, and it's a huge system. It's extremely powerful. It does a lot of great things, and it allows developers to push builds in that automatically turn into containers that go into the CI pipeline and then automatic deploy, load balances, does blue-green deployment of the containers inside. That's amazing. That's super cool. But for sys administrators, or those of us who have sysadmin backgrounds, we're like, okay, wait a minute. How do I manage that thing? How do I, when I have an upgrade come out, what do I do? And a very popular workflow for that is, okay, you create a bunch of new nodes. So because a lot of people will run this inside of a virtual environment or on infrastructure as a service. So, okay, I'll bring a bunch of nodes up. I'll add them into the cluster. I will, because I have a 3-node cluster of the master nodes, I'll do those piece by piece, adding them back into the cluster. I'll add my nodes in the cluster. I'll evacuate all of my pods, which is the unit of compute that runs the containers inside of Kubernetes. And also, fun fact, OpenShift is actually CNCF, Cloud Native Compute Foundation certified Kubernetes. So I'll sometimes use the terms interchangeably.
It's one of a few, isn't it?
It's one of a few, yeah. So there's a handful of them out there. Actually, interesting enough, CoreOS Tectonic also.
The other one.
Yeah. So now within the family as well of the Red Hat family. So anyways, so it'll then evacuate those off of those nodes, bring it over, and then you can destroy those nodes and take them out of rotation. Verbally, that's a relatively, it makes sense. It's a logical progression, and it's not a super complex task, except for the fact that you have to automate and orchestrate a lot of different pieces, and you have to touch different technologies, and you have to, it's like, okay, well, what tool would I use to bring up the virtual machines, and then add them to my VPC, or add storage to them, or provision resources in an environment to maybe CI test the upgrade, or do something with your load balancers to bring things in and out, which isn't probably a big concern because of the multi-node master, but it's a reasonably good practice, even if you have that failover, to just take it out of the load balancer config so you're not having cache misses on your proxy. So load balancer, bring up, do something on the operating system, even if it's just simply, execute a command. Or in Ansible, we actually have Kubernetes and OpenShift native modules that use the backend API, so we don't have to run shell commands, because just like decade-old shell scripts, that can get sticky over time. Yeah, that's reliability. Also, something with Ansible is majority of the modules are what we call idempotent, which means if you run it once and it makes a change. If you run it again, it won't make a change.
It's hard to do with shell scripts.
It's hard to do with shell scripts. And we have some patterns that we document of how to do it. You can say, we'll exit codes. We can basically, but sometimes,
it's a lot of extra work for something that can be super simple.
Exactly. And that's the goal, is to be simple but powerful. And sometimes you struggle with some of those conflicting desires, but you get there as much as you can. So anyway, so we do that, and you have this tool that you can then do this blue-green deployment completely automated, or you can do day-to-day operations. And the idea, and this kind of goes back to the idea of the Ansible everything for the Fedora infrastructure, is like, if you've utilized the utility of the power of the tool as like infrastructure glue, anything that you make for one machine can be done on all. And talking about scale, so scalability. So we have the option of doing multiple forks, and then if you do Ansible Tower or the open source upstream of Tower's AWX, if you use those technologies, you actually have a clustered backend, and you can schedule out groups of runners that will actually run and do the deployment, and then kind of aggregate up into the web console. So we have a lot of options for scale. You're basically limited on how much you can throw behind it. And it's just kind of like a design decision. How much capacity do you need? And when you talk about scale, it's like, okay, well, define scale. Do you need to be able to fire at the exact same time tens of thousands of nodes? Or do you just need all those tens of thousands of nodes to be on the same page within the window of an hour or something? Because then, you talk about what your requirements are for handling those different use cases. So you have some of those different, just needing to know what your parameters are within what you need to work. Because it's web scales, what is scale? What is scale to you, to your infrastructure, to your
different use cases?
Exactly.
What's important there?
Within the parameters, or within the set of variables that you exist, you kind of have to define those things. So, that's kind of the goal. So that's day 0, and then kind of day 1 and 2, you have the integrations to be able to talk to Ansible, but talk to OpenShift from Ansible. I think beyond that, even talking about other technologies and that kind of thing. So Open Service Broker. So Open Service Broker API is another thing out of CNCF that is a standard API that people can define and write services that can talk to. And Amazon, AWS was actually showing a demo in their booth at Summit last week about how you can actually launch services inside of AWS from the OpenShift service catalog. So you can just log in, click a button. If you're a developer, you can click a button or run a command, and then you can actually have your development environment be augmented by AWS. And there's other ones as well. That was just one that's fresh in my mind because I saw the demo last week. Another one is the Ansible Service Broker. So you can actually take that knowledge that you've developed through your operational team, deploying these things and working with these things in Ansible, and you can actually provision. So you have to create a set of playbooks: a provision, a deprovision, a bind, an unbind, and I can't remember the 5th one. And then you bundle in any roles or modules or anything that you rely on, and that gets pushed up into OpenShift in a way that can be advertised again to your users or your developers. So you can actually provision services and advertise them to the container environment through Ansible, and that kind of again, the goal is to not lose your time and effort invested in learning a technology and having a technology in your workflow, knowing standard practices and those kind of things, and being able to take advantage of that in other outlets. So that's an integration between OpenShift and Ansible, and bringing in kind of that platform for your containers, but then being able to augment it with your operational automation. From there, you've got Red Hat Insights. I don't know, that's kind of a newer thing that a lot of people aren't super familiar with. Hopefully we're working on that. But so Insights is actually a predictive analytics stack, which basically it's a software as a service component. You install a couple of agents in your environment. And this can be like your standard RHEL hosts. This can be in OpenShift, OpenStack. There's a few other ones. But basically, let's say a CVE comes out. And we have this knowledge base of all of this stuff that's going on in the products and everything. And we notice that like 10% of your nodes, for some reason, haven't gotten the update for that CVE. We can alert and say, hey, these machines aren't updated. Here is a knowledge base article of how to remediate that. And here's the Ansible playbook. And you can actually tie that into your Ansible Tower environment and just like push a button.
Recommends it and it'll just go.
Remediate. So beyond that, to take it a step further, now there's container native, OpenShift container native iteration of that will actually do scans on your container images. So all the images you have inside your environment that are being iterated on, your developers are working on that kind of stuff. If for some reason somebody's not, updating the base image, the base layer that they're building on top of, for whatever reason, and with OpenShift image streams they really should be, but if for some reason somebody's like pulling some component from external or whatever, we have the ability to scan those. And again, give that alert, give that inflection, and give that introspection. Sorry, introspection is the word I was looking for. Give that introspection into the environment and allow the analysis to say, hey, you have this potential issue that you should probably look into. And that's not even just like CVEs. Let's say you have a bug. Let's say there's a bug in the kernel that for some reason on this specific CPU architecture, after 34 days of uptime, it kernel panics. We can give you that information ahead of time and say, hey, this is your runway. Maybe update and reboot those before that runway. So there's all kinds of use cases. It's not just for the CVEs that come out. There's also for any kind of bugs that get fixed in software. There's the ability to do the analysis and kind of like give you a predictive outlook on your entire environment. From the container component, the OpenShift cluster, and the operating system.
And that's called Red Hat Insights.
It's called Red Hat Insights, and the reason I keep hitting your table, sorry. The reason I call it an Ansible integration, because on the back end, it's actually all implemented in Ansible. And then the Ansible integration of offering up, it's not all, there's a lot of code, but it's powered by Ansible on the back end. And then also you have the integration of it offers playbooks to remediate and that kind of stuff. So there's just a lot of cohesive, kind of technology integration points where Ansible and OpenShift get together, and that's so exciting to me because I'm a fan of both of those technologies, and sometimes because I was previously on the OpenShift team, I get asked, oh, why'd you leave? It's like, well, because for I don't know, gosh, at the time it was like 12 years I'd wanted to work on the Fedora team. The opportunity came up and I couldn't say no. I still love, the team.
It's like your child, it's like a dream.
Yeah, it was a dream. Yeah. And I had like this weird, esoteric finding myself problem of leaving that team because I thought that was going to be the team that I stayed with forever. But, Ansible became just that driving passion because of what it could do and the kind of capabilities that we can help drive and pursue by offering sysadministrators, which is my background. That's kind of like, my tribe, in the ways of operational components, being able to automate that. And that just was a huge thing that spoke to me. So that was my progression. So anyways, but because I am such a big fan of OpenShift as a platform and what the power of containers, bring to the world and what we promise with immutable infrastructure and actually deliver, and I've seen it work and I've, helped deploy it and those kind of things and seeing how we can really automate all of that to try and scale out and, there's this really good phrase that I'm forgetting all of a sudden. Basically allow your operational team or your DevOps workflow practitioners to increase their capacity of throughput, scale themselves, as well as scale the work they do throughout their infrastructure, because we have tools and we have utilities and we have software that can accomplish that.
Automate the easier things to free up your capacity to solve new and bigger problems.
Yes, and allowing the computer to do work for us that we no longer have to do manually or with human people.
Well, now you're almost diving into AI, right? People fear AI. We don't have to dive in there, but it's almost freeing up specific capacity to work on solving bigger problems. But I'll tell you what, I can talk about this stuff all day long. I think you can too. We're probably going to need to do some more interviews, but I'll tell you what, Adam, I greatly appreciate you coming.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome here, and thanks for everything you do. Hearing your story and the community contributions and the roles at Red Hat, those stories were great. We're going to have to do this again. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.